Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 21 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 27, verse 1 through chapter 28, verse 43. With this lesson, we pick up where the last one left off. As a reminder, in case you've lost the context, we've been going through the mechanisms of sanctifying or making holy lots of things. Right? We started with laws, and then we've moved on to and time in terms of holidays, holy days, and now we have and the Sabbath, and now we have space with the tabernacle. Interestingly, being roaming and traveling space. We're going to continue on that side of things and look at the space around the tent as well, and the altar and some things that go in that space around the tent. And then we're going to additionally look at the priests. We'll designate some priests, and then we will talk about specifically what they're wearing. What they do is laid out elsewhere. But it is worth thinking about these things as the order is important. It's not just a random listing of things, right? Like the Ten Commandments, other laws, the consecration of time, then the consecration of space that starts inside at the altar and builds out, and then the priesthood. If you were to rank these things in terms of what's important to do, that is the rank of these things. And that's really helpful because it can be easy that's still the rank. And it can be easy for us to switch some of these things. For example, hearing and keeping God's word is of higher value even than his physical presence in a church. That can be an odd thing to think about, but which one is going to make you closer to God? In the one case, you have to go into the church to be physically close to him, and there's no guarantee that you're relationally close to him just because you're physically close to him, right? But the doing of the laws and the following that will make you relationally closer to God, even if you are physically distant from him. It is more important to your relationship with God, as is the proper observance of these holy days, because again, that's carving out and spending time with God. And then you get to the space, and then you get to the priests who make all of this happen. The priests are subservient to the law and not the other way around, which is a very important biblical principle that does also persist today, although it's not always viewed as such. That's one of the, I would say, philosophical differences between Catholics and Protestants, is especially in some manifestations of Protestantism, like the minister becomes the thing that matters, and what the minister teaches then comes from that minister, and the part that matters is the person and primarily, and then what's said matters secondarily. We do that sometimes too. We don't intend to do that as Catholics. It's not in line with our theology, but it happens, right? We definitely hold up these figures sometimes as like this person is speaking with the mouth of God, and that's not how God speaks to us primarily now, right? The church is how that does it, but the church in aggregate, not this one guy. Again, like God's commandments and teaching in the Word of God, that's the thing that's primary. And the church as an aggregate institution, far bigger deal. Each individual person only matters insofar as they're working in service of that. And if they deviate from that, protest against that, then their position is kind of nullified, right? By they're no longer in line with the thing that matters, which again, like the core spirit of Protestantism of dissenting and objecting and having people recreate and reinterpret what was revealed by God and interpreted using the authority that God granted. Like, it inherently suggests a higher value to the person and a lower value to the revealed. And so that it manifests more sometimes in Protestant denominations because structurally it's possible for that to happen, which is not a knock on certainly all Protestants. There are very serious Bible-believing Protestants who are very devoted to the Word of God, more than many Catholics. Try very much to live that out. So it's not exclusive, right? But on the underpinning structure of that is one that lends itself more to a shift in that priority within Protestant denominations than in Catholic denominations. What really matters here is what are all these things about, right? All these rules. And we've talked about that a lot because we're going through this section, but it's worth, repeating the point for the sake of repeating the point. We are setting things apart, right? With these rules, we're carving out things as separate, as set apart for the sake of God. And that is making them holy. That is sanctifying them. The important thing that happens is, and the tabernacle is the perfect example of this, right? You do all the work, as we talked about, you do all the work, you carve out the space, you set everything up. That's half of it, right? And then that's creating space for God to come in. But then God also needs to come in, right? And if you're creating the space and you're not, and God's not coming in and you're not encountering God in the space that you've created, you're wasting your time. At the time of recording of this video, we are in the season of Lent. And that this concept applies very much to sacrifices we make for Lent, right? Maybe you've been meaning to go on a diet for a while. So you decide, oh, it's Lent, so I'm going to not eat sweets for Lent. Maybe I can lose a couple of pounds that way. Well, what are you doing with that thing? Maybe you're carving out space. Well, what's it for and what's going to come into that space then? Well, what are you going to fill it with, right? You're not really carving out a space for God, right? You're doing a thing that you've been putting off for a long time. It can be both, right? If you lose weight during Lent as a side effect of a thing you gave up, great. If you give up the thing because you want to lose weight, then you're not carving out the space for God, right? You might be carving out the space, but you're not carving out the space for God. Or if you stop watching TV and so then you end up surfing the internet for 5 hours in an evening instead of watching TV, what went into the space that you created, right? More trash. Okay, you gave something up, you hit the letter of the law on the season of Lent. Good for you. What you didn't do is use a sacrifice to carve out, to sanctify something. By the way, the words sacrifice and sanctify, while they have very different meanings in English, are identical from an etymological point of view, right? The sacra and the sancta, same thing. The feis and the phi both come from a Latin word that means to do or to make, from the same word. They're the same word. Sacrifice and sanctify are the same word. You should be, in your sacrifice for Lent, carving out a space to sanctify something. And that should be allowing God to come into that space, right? That's what all of this is meant to do, right? You're carving out boundaries, barriers between you and not you. to allow a space where God can come that's, less dirty than you. And in doing that, like, you're creating a place that God can come and hang out. And then if you do that, and then God is in that space to hang out with you, and you're over there doing something else, you missed the point, right? Like, all of this is a means of creating a structure wherein humans can encounter God, right? It's all recreating that mountain where they're physically at when all of this is happening, right? All of this is happening and they physically have God up on a mountain and them down below, and they have the means of encountering God. But what happens when they leave the mountain? How do they encounter God? And they did really badly at encountering God on the mountain. How do they improve and develop so that they can take those steps closer to God once they leave the mountain? So all of this sanctifying stuff, all of these rules and all of the stuff we're doing is about how do you carve out a space so God can be. We should do that. We don't have to do it by wearing purple linen vestments or having giant tents instead of churches, right? Like, the literal aspect of every part of how this is done is not the important part to our lives today. But the idea that we have to create separation in our lives between ourselves, from ourselves, to create a space where God can be, and then we have to encounter God there, is still very much the thing, right? Like, that's still so important. That's why these old books like Exodus and so much like Leviticus, which gets a bad knock for being boring, but it's all about how to be holy, and the underpinnings and the foundations of holiness are spelled out so much in that book. It's amazing. But if you read it as, I shouldn't eat shellfish, then it's boring. If you read it as reinforcing how does one be holy, and how do those barriers and separations work in our lives to create a space for encounter with God, then it's phenomenal. And this is a little tease of some of that, right? Like, this is how we have relationship with God. You don't have relationship with God without creating a space for that to happen in, period. And you don't create that space without sacrifice, sanctification, right? Like, this is that, right? You have to create the space for God to come, and then you meet God in the space. And that's what we're doing here. And I'm ranting on the point a little bit, but it's so important, right? It's the point of, like, this big section in the book of Exodus is all about creating space for encounter with God. And especially in this season of Lent, it's been on my mind because I see Catholics get this wrong so much, right? Like, oh, I'm just giving something up for Lent and going about my life. And okay, congratulations, you've met the letter of the law. But the point is to be teaching you and reinforcing for you that act of creating a space to spend time with God. You don't go out into the wilderness just to hang out in the desert and get a tan, right? You go out into the wilderness to meet God. And if you don't meet God out in the wilderness, then you're just some dummy out in the wilderness. And it's a waste. You've achieved nothing, except maybe a nice tan, probably some sunburn, and some dehydration. Much better, if you're not going to meet God, to stay at home where it's comfortable and air conditioned. But if you can meet God out in the desert, great, do that. But the whole point of all of this is to facilitate a relationship with God that you then need to nurture, or you've missed the point. Here we build an altar. This is one that maybe can be confusing for Catholics, because for us, the thing that lives where the ark goes, in the tabernacle, we put an altar, and a tabernacle hopefully behind that. But the altar has a big place of prominence, like we call the whole altar area the altar, right? You've got the raised place in your church where the table is. An altar is a table, right? But the whole thing is so significant that often we call the whole raised area the altar, even though, like, strictly speaking, the table is the altar. That's how prominent it is for us, right? It's the center of our Mass. It is where God comes to meet us, right? It is that place that is represented by the ark. As Catholics, then, we're used to the altar as like high central place of prominence, right? And like synonymous with how the ark is viewed here for the Israelites. This isn't that. It's an altar, but it's not in the middle of things. It is not in the tabernacle at all. It is outside of the tabernacle, which is both because of its function and there are practical considerations as well, right? Like, again, this gets to the sacrifice of animals is not in and of itself significant or of primary importance, right? So there's a map in the back of the study that shows this whole area and everything when it's set up. It's at the very end, and it's worth looking at. That shows you have not only the ark, but you have the whole, or the tabernacle, but the whole courtyard area as well. The altar is out in the courtyard toward the entrance to the courtyard. So it's edge, right? Around the edges. Not quite at the edge, but ish. The place where you're meeting God is not at the altar. For us, where you're meeting God is on the altar, right? God is coming down and becoming present on the altar. So that's the thing that happens at the ark, right? Is God is present there in the mercy seat, and so that ark is important because that's where God is. For us, because of what Jesus did, the altar that was way outside and the ark come together, right? Which is symbolic of so many things, because of course everyday people couldn't go into where the ark was, but they could go around the altar. So all of a sudden, when you have God coming to the altar instead of God coming to the ark, the image, and I think it's the Gospel according to Matthew, is one of that inner veil that got set up, like tearing apart, right? Ripping, with the image of it being from inside out, right? But for sure tearing that veil, right? Some of those walls that separate divinity and humanity are breaking down. You still have to be in the courtyard area of the temple where the altar is to meet God, but you are a few steps closer than you were before. You can now meet God at the base of the mountain instead of on the top of the mountain. You can't meet him in the next county over when he's on the mountain, right? But you don't have to go up, you don't have to climb the summit to meet him anymore. You can be right there at the base where all the people were settled in and willing to go. And that's that courtyard area where the altar is, where God now is coming. We can't go to him, so he came to us. And the place for him to come to us, was the place of sacrifice. And there are two ways to be there without being, well, there are three ways to be there, right? You can be the priest, we'll get to that. You can be the one bringing the sacrifice, just some other common person, or you can be the animal that's being killed. He's all three of those, right? He's the animal being killed. He, as a human, is still a supplicant making an offering to God, and he's a priest, the one executing or carrying out the offering, right? He meets us as carrying out all three functions that happen at that altar in and of himself. And we get to be, other bystanders in the courtyard while that's happening. And we can meet God there. So our holy place has moved from the top of the mountain down to the courtyard where we can meet, or the base where we can meet God. It's a really big deal and a fascinating thing that happens. But for now, altar, not like we think of it. It's outside. It is a table for sacrificing animals, and it is set up and built to serve that purpose. So it's not made out of gold. It's overlaid with bronze instead of gold, and it's the whole thing is set up and built to be a place where you've got your table, you bring your animal, you put your animal on the table, and then you do. I'm not going to demonstrate because I love my cat. And then you can kill your animal, right? And that again, that sacrifice, sanctify, right? That's still a thing that you're doing that is carving out for yourself a space for God. And as you do that, it's toward the entrance to the courtyard, because that's the thing you do, like, if you're not in good relationship with God, and it gets you back in enough good graces with God that you can enter and hang out in that courtyard. So we built an altar. One last point to avoid possible confusion. There is an altar. Remember, altar equals table. Inside of the inner part, the Holy of Holies inside of this tent, the altar of incense. That's a table. That table is designed to hold things that smell good, and it's covered with gold. This outside table is a table designed for killing. It's much bigger, more brutal, and not as valuable in terms of what's coating it. Both are called altars because the word altar means table, but no sacrifices happen on the inside one. Practically speaking, it's also a really good idea that they do this part outside for, I think, very obvious reasons. This part's easy. Now we are setting, so we have the tent, right? Everything is in layers, right? You have inner chamber of the tent, then you have outer chamber of the tent, and now we have like a courtyard, a much bigger courtyard around the outer layer of the tent. And then there's everything else, right? And every layer has different criteria for entry, right? Any of God's people can go into this courtyard. Any of the priests can, and possibly the Levites, I don't remember, probably can go into the outside part of the tent. And as things progress, fewer people and under more and more stringent circumstances can go into the inner chamber. As it's a tent and it's traveling around, you can't do the thing where somebody only goes in once a year, right? Because you're moving, and you've got to be able to move the ark. So more people, while this is all using as intended to travel, can go in, but still very limited. And by the time it's settled in and it's not moving, only one person can go in, and eventually only once a year does the high priest go into the Holy of Holies. So these tiers then aren't just arbitrary, hey, we like layers, but different people can go, by position, can go closer and closer, right? And then God is at the middle. And Moses teaches us a very interesting thing about that as well, right? Because Moses is, we'll see, but he primarily is the one hanging out in the inner chamber, and he's not a priest, right? So the rules are there, but a prophet kind of skips the rules and can go straight into contact with God, right? So who are these layers for? If you already have the relationship with God, right? Moses could go up the mountain, and that's what this is meant to be, right? So this is like an artificial recreation of the mountain. Of course, Moses can go into the tabernacle. Moses can go up the mountain. But people can go into the tabernacle who couldn't go up the mountain, right? This is the safe version. If you are someone who has a relationship with God that's sufficiently advanced on its own, then these arbitrary structures lose a lot of meaning for you. For example, David walks in and eats the showbread, right? When he's fleeing and he's hungry. And that's fine. David had a relationship with God. David could go up the mountain, and that's just bread. If you're at the point of, if you have the relationship with God that David does, that's just bread. If you're whatever priest, that, all of this function, all of this form serves to help establish your relationship with God, it's very important that you follow it. But there are pathways to just right on through. And that's useful to think about, because again, we inherit our access through Jesus, who certainly has any kind of access he wants to, even if he's not a Levitical priest, right? Because he doesn't need to be, because he is the altar or he is the tabernacle. Among the images start to collapse on one another in Jesus, right? And all of these different things will sort of become one. So at any rate, we've got this outer space which is where all the people God's people can come. If you're not an Israelite, you don't even get to go there, right? You're outside still. Even if you're a Gentile who wants to worship God, you're outside of this courtyard. So or if you're not in good standing, like you're unclean, or you ate shellfish, or all the rules, right? There are a lot of rules, and the place that you can't go if you get unclean by any of all of these various means is you can't go into this courtyard. So one more layer of separation here. Not as you can tell, the like posts or pillars are bronze with silver fastenings instead of gold like the inside tent, right? Carrying on the theme that we're getting less valuable as we go, but one last layer of courtyard. Last but not least, then, we keep a fire constantly burning inside the tabernacle, outside of the inner chamber of the tabernacle. We keep a candle burning continually in the presence of the ark. And that candle comes to denote the presence of God, which is why in a Catholic church today, there is a red candle where the tabernacle is also burning all the time. For the same reason, to mark the presence of God. We have the space now, so we get to move next on to the ministers of the space. We have some priests. We have Aaron and Aaron's sons. I've already gone over it, but again, not Moses, right? Moses is a prophet, but he is not a priest. This is a line from strong relationship to Moses, obviously Moses' brother, but not Moses. And Moses' lineage doesn't matter at all. And Aaron's does, because this priesthood is hereditary. That matters so much for the future of these people. And it's possible to trace this idea of Aaron mattering at all and any of this happening back to Moses' early decision when God said, yeah, you, Moses, just go talk to Pharaoh for me and, tell him to let my people go. And Moses says, I'm not a fan of public speaking. God proposes then to Moses, hey, if you don't like public speaking, you can have Aaron do it for you. And you'll talk to Aaron, and Aaron will talk to Pharaoh, and we'll do it that way. As the book progressed, if you were paying attention or watching these videos, you probably noticed that Aaron did less and less as Moses' confidence grew and his relationship with God as well, right? Like God always knew that Moses could do it and like who Moses should be. But there was that decision that there are a couple decisions at play here, right? There's that one where Moses carves off like a public facing part of what God was asking him to do and says no. And then Aaron has stood up to do it. So you have what could have been one thing is now two. And then you have the people invited at the base of the mountain where God is coming. There's a hint of, you all could come up here. And then there's a pretty wholesale rejection of that, and then an agreement of, actually you're right. If that's going to be your attitude, then if you'd have come up here, you definitely wouldn't have gone well for you. You're right. We have this separation. And God ratifying, right? In both cases, God ratifies a decision of the people and takes an idea represented by Moses, this one guy who is the intermediary between God and the people, and who himself is able to go up the mountain and could possibly have brought the people up the mountain to meet God. And instead you add another layer of intermediary between Moses and the people firmly entrenched down at the base of the mountain. So these couple of rejections of a thing that could have been create a need for a place at the base of the mountain where the people meet God. And Aaron, he's good at just staying down there because he can't go up any more than Moses can, right? So you entrench this infrastructure around the idea that the priests are down at the bottom of the mountain with the people serving as intermediaries, but then the priests themselves, and this is the core problem, can't go up the mountain, right? They can sort of go into the tent, but they're still not Moses, right? They really need someone else to get them all the way up the mountain or all the way into the tent. And while we'll see, while Moses is up on the mountain communing with God, Aaron down at the base of the mountain, I'm sure, is doing very holy things. We'll see what that looks like. Definitely won't be any problems. But that's the core issue of this priesthood from its foundation, is they're spun off from someone who does have that relationship with God and can go up the mountain, and they're not that. And so they're stuck at the base with the people. And again, we'll see immediately as the story unfolds here at the base of the mountain how that works. And that's like the perfect image for how this works, right? Like the priest, how can you serve as an intermediary to a God that you don't know? Aaron never knows God. Aaron knows Moses, right? Like God will speak to Moses, and Moses will speak to Aaron as though he's God. Aaron doesn't know God. And that's what we create here. With a few exceptions along the way, we create like a vocational hereditary priesthood where a relationship with God is not a qualification, only birth. And so by and large, people settle into being priests like they would settle into doing any other job. And it's a cushy job at that. And many of them take advantage. And it's the whole structure of the thing is not set up to succeed. And it's worth reflecting on that just a bit right here, and a whole lot more in the thing that's going to happen soon. But from a structural point of view, this is a deviation from what could have been, right? Imagine if the prophet himself were the priest and had that direct relationship with God and could serve as a more direct intermediary. That doesn't happen for a long time. It does happen once before Jesus in the form of Ezra, who is a fascinating character. But there are other things that Ezra also doesn't bring to the table that ultimately, by that time, you've got kings as well. And so there you have a guy serving in a lot of roles, but he's not a king. He doesn't have or want that political authority that's splintered off also from the prophets along the way. Well, you get there and, the kings, and leading up to. So long story short, you've got this infrastructure that creates too much separation, right? We talked about separation being a space where holiness can live. This doesn't necessarily lend itself to that because you're creating separation, but you're getting more distant from God with all of these layers of separation instead of closer to God. And I've made the point. It creates problems, and we'll come back to that. But it's worth noting here as we first say this priesthood is going to be Aaron and his sons, with the implication that it's going to be hereditary. But for now, okay, we haven't gotten anything bad happening yet. We can celebrate it for a moment. We're going to have priests. These people have had no access to God or to anyone who does have access to God since, well, we had Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. It is not clear that any of Joseph's brothers really had his relationship with God, as evidenced by their attempted fratricide. And there's really no evidence that they ever really went, oh yeah, I shouldn't do that because God, or have any encounter that any of them have with God, right? So at some point, Joseph dies, and then it's not clear that anyone has had that relationship with God to bring to any of these people as they've continued to grow, right? They've kept practicing circumcision and they've tried to serve God, but they've had no clear intermediaries at all. So for these people, this is a big, for all of its flaws, this is still a notable improvement. Moses is around, but he's getting very old at this point, and he's not going to live forever on this earth. And God is not interested in calling up prophets to lead his people all the time, like Moses, right? That's saved for special circumstances. So to fill the gap of Moses' earthly mortality, we need something in place, and that is this. And it's so important that it's not from Moses' line directly, because we wouldn't want to get the idea that a prophet is a hereditary office, right? And all the things that happen with kings and with priests and all the stuff that goes wrong there, the office of prophet is preserved and never loses how in line with God it is, right? God just picks a random person and says, you're coming with me. I have a thing for you to do. Go give bad news to these people. And maybe they'll repent. And that role stays pristine because it is selected and shaped by God personally. But through normal human operations, first the priests and later the kings and probably some judges along the way find themselves in a deteriorating state because they're very human things, and the prophet stays a divine institution. By the way, that all still has a tremendous amount of relevance to us today, as we are members of an institution that is both at once divine and protected by God and human, made up of flawed and failing people together in one entity of the church. So for us, like for them, God protects a part that has to be pristine and immaculate and flawless, and then the rest of the structure around and in service to it is hit or miss, let's say. And those two things can exist at the same time in God's people and in God's church. So here we have some priests, and we're going to make for them garments to use in serving as priests. It seems, order of operation, again, right? We're making the garments before we've actually anointed any of these guys priests. Which is more important? The garments and the office they represent are more important than the individual guys who are serving as priests. So we're going to make the garments first. I'm not going to expand in great detail upon what these robes look or vestments look like. There's a picture in the book on page 106. An illustration from Tammy that does a great job helping to visualize that, and me trying to describe something that you can read to help you visualize it, I don't think is a helpful. You can look, right? I think that's a lot better. I will, however, make one connection that I think is fascinating here, which is between the materials used in these vestments and the tabernacle, where in the construction of the tabernacle do you find things paralleling what we're making these vestments out of. It's the inside part, right? Like, so the office, this thing you're putting on as a priest that effectively makes you a priest every bit as much as your heredity, this office is a mirroring of the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, and is marking, like, it's around you, right? And like they share things similar to like the veil and what goes inside. By vestments, we're marking the priest the way we're marking out the place where God is. That's not an accident. And we're also marking the priest with things that name the 12 tribes of Israel. So the priest as a representation of all of the people of Israel who can't go inside the ark, inside the tabernacle, to where the ark is clothed with the people, right? The priest bears the people into the presence of God. And the priest can go into the presence of God, right? By clothing, not as a guy, right? If you take off the clothing, then all of a sudden, you have Aaron. Can Aaron go up the mountain? No. Can Aaron, clothed with the office of priest, go up the mountain? Yes. The clothing literally makes the man in this case. It's the office makes him into a thing that he is not otherwise and allows him to go into the presence of God. That's a big deal. That still happens. It happens now sacramentally and through anointing, rather than wearing black or wearing vestments during Mass, or the collar, or the things we think of, or the stole, are physical and clothing related ways that we mark a priest. But the thing that allows the priest to enter into the service of God is the anointing with oil for us now, and the sacramental thing that achieves. It's still good that we do a lot of these other things, but it's now it's more symbolic and visual for us. Whereas, and we'll see Moses does anoint priests back then as well, right? Much of the things are going to be the same. But for us, the anointing, because it's sacramental, comes to bear more importance than the dress. Whereas here, the clothing was important because it is the office. dressed as a normal guy, you're not a priest. You put on this clothing, you are a priest. You're a normal guy, you can't climb the mountain. You're a priest, you can. The clothing makes all of the difference. There are layers to this clothing here, but from I think really deep and underlying meaning of what's going on here, this is more of the same, right? What it's made out of matters a great deal because of its similarity to the inside of the ark, and everything else about it is kind of, it's the style of the time, sort of, but fancied up, right? And it doesn't matter much more than that. Like the robes our priests wear today, they became traditional, so now you would never see anyone wearing that out on the street. But at the time that started happening, it was a fancy version of what people wore out on the street. And then it just sort of became institutionalized, and so we changed what we wear, but we didn't change what we worship with, which is neat. It's good to have some traditions, but the exact what of being worn, not important. The connection to the tabernacle, fascinating. So a few things here. On the breastpiece of judgment are the names of the tribes of Israel. This isn't explained well, which is why I didn't mention it in the last question. When it's first named, you think, oh, this is the breastpiece Aaron's going to put on when he passes judgment on all of these people, and like a fancy barrister wig or something, right? But no, this is not for him to pass judgment, or it's for him to have judgment passed upon him, right? That's why it has the names of everybody, and we see the last line here. Thus Aaron shall bear the judgment of the sons of Israel upon his heart before the Lord continually, right? Like this is like entering into the Holy of Holies to be judged by God in clothing form. You put that on and it's like you're stepping into the presence of God. And if you're doing bad by the people, it's like you're exposing yourself to the judgment of God, right? The garment is the office, and it bears a great similarity to being in the Holy of Holies when you put it on, except you can take it anywhere. That's the judgment. You're inviting judgment upon yourself for the behavior of the people, not you're casting judgment on the people as some judge. And then there's the Urim and the Thummim. Short version, we don't know what that is. Speculation is that it was involved in divination, but like God-themed divination, where you like cast dice or something, and like, God, if I roll a 7, then I'll go north, whatever sort of thing, right? That's the suggestion, but we don't know. And while it seems important when we don't know, it doesn't matter, right? And we can talk about the parts that we do know, which matter, which is, again, an extension of the idea that putting on these garments are like entering into the Holy of Holies, and you're bringing the people with you. More of the same here, more of the garments. The neat addition is one of bells that always mark the presence of the priest. And there's, here it's straight up said instead of implied that if the priest isn't wearing this garment with these bells when he goes into the holy place before the Lord, he will die. And it's not because God likes the sound of bells, but again, you're making this a special thing, and it's something that gets attention. We also today, still, when the presence of God happens at the Mass during the consecration, ring bells. It marks we use it to mark, like, pay attention, this is the presence of God. And that the priest is wearing that, right? But again, it's the garments and not the priest. He takes them off, no more ringing, no more priest, just a guy, right? Then he puts them on, ringing, clothed like the like the garment. We're reiterating the garment for multiple senses is setting the priest. If you happened to be blind, you would still know there's a priest, right? You don't just have to see it. It's all about setting the priest apart with the mark of the office. And then to literally top all of this off, we take a plate of pure gold and engrave on it "Holy to the Lord," and it's to be on the priest's forehead all the time. Again, holy or set apart, right? Which is what these clothes are doing. And it's literally, in case the point was missed, it's literally written down and there for everybody to see as well. But that written word is also binding, right? It writes what the office of priest is meant to be there on the priest's head and binds the priest to it, so that Aaron shall take upon himself any guilt incurred in the holy offering and like in the things that are the duties that a priest carries out. If there's guilt incurred in how any of that is done, it is taken upon the priest by virtue of this writing on their head. It binds them to their office, as much as when we have oil and are anointed on our foreheads with the name of Christ, we are likewise bound in the service of God and culpable for failure to do so. It's not the only place there's relevant in the Bible. There's relevant marking on a forehead, but it's a poignant one, and it's again a thing that it's meant to also serve as like a constant reminder to the priests of that obligation that they have. Again, I'm sure that will work spectacularly well, and there will never be any problems because everybody knows written words phasing out up where your eyes can't see are a perfect reminder all the time that you can never forget. Like things written on your shirt, right? Like you definitely always are aware of what's written on the shirt you're wearing. It's a good idea. I'm not trying to mock the idea, but it's also easy to just become a thing that's on and to lose sight, pardon the pun, of the thing that that you're displaying to the world. So all of this stuff has been for Aaron, not Aaron and sons. There is a high priest and other priests from the beginning. There are tiers in space. There are tiers in priesthood. You have one priest above all others, predominantly responsible for everything we just talked about, what this office represents. And then as an extension and under this one priest, in this case genetically and usually so, right? The high priest is going to be also genetic, right? It's going to be the oldest surviving person from the favored line. Is still going to be the high priest, and then everybody else is a priest. You've got the one, and then beneath the one, you've got other priests who are also marked out by their clothing, but way less fancily so. And specifically, there is common garment and attire, and there's definitely, you're not going before the Lord naked, or that's going to be a problem. And they're still unified by what they wear. But this has still come down to us today, even in a clothing format, by the way, right? Like, we've got the one guy, and if you're a cardinal and you're out dressing the Pope in like a liturgical ceremony, that's a problem, right? Like, the guy, whoever is the highest ranking at whatever is happening, is going to be the best dressed. and that persists to today. And it would actually, I think I've never seen it happen. I would be shocked if I ever saw not the top guy as the one who's best dressed in one. It would be appalling to see because it doesn't happen, and it's been ingrained, right? You can rank Catholic officials by how they're dressed, especially at Mass. Outside of Mass, outside of liturgical functions, all bets are off, right? Some of them like nicer and fancier clothes than others. Some might be part of an order and wear a robe or a garment as part of that. But when they're celebrating the Mass, it's a big deal, and they dress accordingly. And that's kind of what this is about, because we're talking about when they're celebrating or when they're offering at the altar sacrifice. So there's like a common state of dress and that is a part of the job of priests that involves the sacrifices. So that's the part here as well. This has been an overview of Lesson 21 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.